Welcome to the debate. Today we're delving into two foundational records concerning the Law of Moses. We have the book of Deuteronomy, which is, the canonical text from the Hebrew Bible that most people are familiar with. And then there's this recently translated text known as HaTorah, or the Book of Instructions. This one purports to be older, maybe predating the standard version. Both texts cover Moses' final addresses and the covenant given at Horeb, or Mount Ha-Elohim, as HaTorah calls it.
Right. And the emergence of this HaTorah text really brings a central question into focus for us. How much do the differences, textual, theological, between the standard Deuteronomy and this potentially older HaTorah actually, change the fundamental purpose or the application of the law for believers today, or for those trying to understand the covenant?
Mm-hmm. Well, my position is really one of fundamental continuity. I'd argue that the core covenant, the essential moral laws, the practical guidelines for living, for governance, it all remains substantially consistent across both texts. The variations we find in HaTorah, I think, are often more like editorial clarifications or shifts in emphasis, perhaps valuable ones, but they don't fundamentally rewrite the basic agreement between God and Israel.
See, I have to take issue with that framing. I believe that some very specific additions, and maybe even more importantly, some specific omissions within HaTorah, introduce really quite profound distinctions. Differences in theology, yes, but also in the understanding of institutional authority and governance. And these distinctions, I think, are significant enough that they really demand we reevaluate how we understand that foundational covenant, and what parts of it were truly considered fixed.
Okay, well, let's start perhaps with the continuity aspect, specifically regarding the covenant itself. The essential legal basis for Israel taking the Promised Land seems identical. I mean, both texts hammer home this idea: if you observe the statutes and judgments, then you will possess the land. It's transactional, it's conditional, and it defines their whole existence there. They also share those key historical moments, right? The defeat of Sihon and Og, that disastrous rebellion at Kadesh Barnea, and then the command, the very difficult command, to utterly destroy certain Canaanite nations. So the basic story, the historical memory, the core strategy for settlement, it's all preserved. That stability points to a unified legal tradition, wouldn't you say? And beyond that, look at the social laws. The duty to leave grain for the poor, the constant reminder to care for the stranger because, you were strangers in Egypt. That core material for building a just society feels remarkably stable.
Okay, I grant you the historical outline is similar, but, that's maybe not the highest bar, is it? Any revision of a law code is going to build on the history it inherits. The real question is about the conceptual shifts guiding that law. And that's where I think the differences become critical, starting right at the top with the Decalogue, the 10 words themselves. HaTorah takes a different approach. It opens not just by saying, "I am the Lord your God," but with the specific command to love Yahweh with all your heart, all your might, all your strength.
The Shema.
Exactly. Putting the Shema, that call for total love and devotion, as the very first word, that frames the entire legal code in relational terms right from the outset. It's not just about rules, it's about relationship first. It shifts the whole spiritual center of gravity, prioritizing that inner devotion before you even get to the external prohibitions, like no other gods.
I definitely see why you emphasize that particular ordering. It is striking, but let me offer a slightly different angle. Deuteronomy itself repeatedly frames the law's purpose around love and fear, doesn't it? It tells Israel these laws are given that thou mightest fear the Lord thy God. And then, very soon after listing the Decalogue, it includes that same command to love God. So even if the order in the list is different, the essence of those key commandments, exclusive worship, no idols, keep the Sabbath, that core is constant. The fundamental relationship with God, the moral requirements, they seem consistent. Whether the command to love is listed as item number 1 or as the guiding principle laid out immediately after the laws are given.
Well, I'd argue that in a foundational legal text, order is substance. It dictates priority. But okay, let's maybe move beyond the Decalogue itself to the question of institutional authority.
because this is where I think the difference becomes really profound, and it centers on the tablets of the covenant. HaTorah includes this very explicit note from Moses. He says that when he rewrote the stone tablets, after the golden calf incident, the words inscribed were identical to the first set, except for, and this is the quote, "save the words of the everlasting covenant of the holy priesthood." That specific omission, mentioned right there in the text, it seems to suggest that a fundamental aspect of the covenant, one dealing with the mediating authority of a higher priesthood, was deliberately removed, or perhaps withheld from the version given to the general populace at that specific time.
That's certainly a very potent detail from HaTorah. Let's be clear what we're potentially discussing here. This everlasting covenant of the holy priesthood sounds like it refers to a higher order, maybe a Melchizedek-style priesthood, a direct mediated authority, and its explicit absence from the second set of tablets, the set that was actually kept and taught, that does point towards, well, maybe a kind of spiritual limitation placed on the people after the rebellion, or a change in how that authority was administered.
Exactly my point. And I'm sorry, but I just can't accept that this omission is some minor editorial gloss. This textual detail points to a potentially radical difference in the kind of institutional authority being established or recognized at Horeb Elohim. If the primary mechanism for, say, ultimate atonement or direct divine mediation via the specific priesthood is missing from the foundational text given to the community, well, where does that leave the operational mechanics of the covenant for the people?
It's a very interesting point, you're right. Though, I think I'd frame the implication differently. While HaTorah specifically notes the exclusion of this particular high priesthood covenant from the text the people received, that doesn't necessarily mean there was an institutional void in God's administration. Deuteronomy, after all, maintains a very clear, functioning authority structure centered on the Levites. They minister, they carry the ark, they handle the sacrifices. Deuteronomy says the Levites were chosen to stand to minister in the name of the Lord, him and his sons forever. That sounds like a pretty solid structure.
But wait, the existence of the Levitical priesthood, which is certainly there, doesn't necessarily compensate for a missing everlasting covenant, does it? The phrasing implies something maybe distinct, perhaps a higher order, maybe not strictly hereditary in the same way or tied to lineage like the Aaronic line within Levi. And this potential gap in HaTorah, this missing piece, seems to be addressed by the text's strong emphasis on a really comprehensive civil government. The text goes into detail about a king, numerous judges, and then, quite remarkably, a council of wise men and women chosen from among this people.
Yes, the inclusion of that council, particularly the mention of women, is definitely significant. I agree.
I think it's more than just significant. It might suggest a kind of compensatory structure. If that higher, perhaps more directly spiritual authority associated with the everlasting priesthood covenant is withheld or removed from the people's text, then the functioning civil government, with its detailed system of council and judges, effectively has to become the supreme operational authority for the community on the ground. This detailed description of governance, especially the council, goes well beyond the description of the king's duties we find in the standard Deuteronomy. It could suggest a different model for how the people were expected to manage their affairs, perhaps precisely because that higher spiritual authority wasn't being administered in the same way.
I see the logic, but I tend to think the HaTorah emphasis on judges and this council simply flushes out a comprehensive judicial system that's built upon the existing Levitical religious structure rather than replacing it. I mean, look at the fundamentals. Both texts agree the Levites get no land inheritance. Instead, they eat the offerings. That's a core economic and religious continuity that anchors the system in both versions. So, the specific mention of a council in HaTorah clarifies the civil side, yes, but doesn't necessarily negate the established religious institutions.
I believe it radically elevates the role of the people in their own administration, especially when you consider that phrase, council of wise men and women. And that leads us naturally into the unique social ethics that HaTorah brings forward. These details, I think, are profoundly relevant for understanding the full scope and maybe the intended social structure of the covenant.
Yes, please do elaborate on that. The specific instructions around family dynamics and gender roles are certainly among the most fascinating points of difference.
Well, HaTorah lays out some very specific rules about family authority and inheritance that are quite distinctive. For instance, it states quite plainly that the primary authority over every child is the mother. That's a pretty clear statement. About matriarchal influence, or at least primary responsibility, within the family unit. It feels more defined than the general command in Deuteronomy simply to honor both parents. And then, as we touched on, HaTorah details the potential role of women not just as wise counselors, but as inheritors and even rulers, describing righteous daughters who could be chosen of Yahweh to be a queen and a ruler over her house.
When I first encountered that reference to the council, including wise women, I have to admit that was a moment of profound realization. It really forces a reconsideration of the standard narratives about governance in the ancient Near East, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And these instructions aren't just general principles, they're formalized roles within the covenant structure. When one foundational text specifically mandates that the highest civil council should include women learned in the law, and the other text doesn't mention it, well, that's not just a minor nuance. That points to a different institutional expectation regarding the role and potential of women within the covenant administration itself. It offers a significantly expanded vision of social equity and leadership potential compared to how Deuteronomy is often read.
Okay. While the specific formalization you highlight in HaTorah is undeniable and very interesting, I still maintain that Deuteronomy already establishes the moral groundwork for this kind of respect. It lays down curses for those who treat their father or their mother lightly. It mandates justice for the widow and the fatherless repeatedly. So while HaTorah might spell out the king's counsel or define maternal authority more explicitly, the underlying principles of equity, fairness, and respect for vulnerability, which are arguably at the heart of the covenant's social application, are already robustly present in Deuteronomy. Both texts, for instance, demand multiple witnesses to establish justice. The foundation is there.
I have to disagree that these are just elaborations. Defining the mother as the primary authority, including women in the High Council, these feel like architectural changes to the structure of power in society. I see them as structural adjustments, perhaps directly linked to the need for a strong, comprehensive civil authority, precisely because that higher priesthood covenant isn't explicitly part of the package given to the wider populace in HaTorah's account. They look like evidence of a different organizational blueprint for how Israel was meant to function.
Looking at both, though, the comparison really demonstrates, for me, that the core covenant identity, who Israel is meant to be, and the fundamental instructions for holiness, for justice, they remain profoundly stable across these two documents. HaTorah, from my perspective, serves less as some kind of revolutionary alternative scripture and more like a detailed interpretive lens. It clarifies, it emphasizes, but it illuminates the application of timeless laws first laid down in the wilderness. The essential path to a righteous society. Love God, uphold justice, reject idolatry. That path seems constant.
And conversely, I'd argue the textual differences are significant enough to mark HaTorah as a textuologically distinct foundational document. The reframing of the 10 words to start with relational devotion, the explicit noted omission of the everlasting priesthood from the second set of tablets, and then the inclusion of these unique, detailed institutions of, you could almost say, secular governance, complete with women in high council. These elements offer a deeper and sometimes contrasting insight. Insight into the nature of authority, maybe the limitations placed upon the covenant people at certain historical moments. It really forces a careful reconsideration of which elements of the law were seen as absolutely immutable, and which might have been adjusted based on Israel's spiritual state or capacity at the time of Horeb.
It's clear the material offers a complex, certainly a multi-layered understanding of the law of Moses.
It certainly does, and it definitely invites continued reflection on how these varying historical records and theological nuances shape our understanding of the covenant's enduring power and its application across time.